You may not be familiar with the name of Polish artist Zdzisław Beksiński, but you're bound to have come across examples of his instantly recognisable, dark, surrealist paintings, or at least works influenced by his unique, apocalyptic vision of the world. Welcome to Insane History. I am Graeme Yorston, and today I'm exploring the life of Polish artist Zdzisław Beksiński to find out what kind of man could have created such nightmarish works of art. He led an extraordinary life. He was original, prolific, and immensely influential as an artist. But it was a life tinged with tragedy, and he met a sudden, violent end that no one saw coming. Zdzisław Beksiński was born in 1929 in the historic town of Sanok in southern Poland, close to its modern border with Ukraine. He was from an established family of several generations of architects and engineers. When he was 10, Poland was invaded by Germany and Russia and carved into two, setting in motion the cataclysmic events of the Second World War. Sanok was in the German-occupied zone, and arrests and executions of Poles began almost immediately. And of the town's sizable Jewish community, around 30% of the total, almost all were taken to concentration camps, never to return. Somehow, life continued after a fashion, and Beksiński attended a trade school in Sanok. The Polish language was banned, and children had to be taught about Polish culture secretly, but he learned to play the piano, at least until he lost part of his left thumb and index finger in an explosion when he was playing with unexploded ordnance. In 1941, the Germans invaded the Soviet-occupied eastern half of Poland as part of their advance on Russia, and Sanok remained under German control until its so-called liberation by advancing Soviet forces at the end of the war. After finishing school in 1947, Beksiński wanted to study at the Academy of Fine Arts in Warsaw, and he won a place with his early work. But his father persuaded him to study architecture at the Krakow University of Technology instead. While in Krakow, he met and married Zofia Stankiewicz, and after completing his studies in 1952, he was assigned jobs by the Soviet-controlled authorities to work on construction sites in Krakow and Zdzisław. The grind of these uninspiring jobs led to him coming to hate architecture, feeling it was just about endless, boring mechanical plans. In 1955, he returned to his hometown where his only son Tomasz was born 3 years later. Beksiński worked for the Commission for Arranging Housing and joined the Polish Photographic Society, and in his spare time he began creating montage photographic images. These early photographs depict human figures, often distorted or in unusual poses, crouching or hiding as if scared, bound up in string or framed so that only fragments are visible. Often it was his wife, Zofia, who was the model for these photographs. He also created bleak landscapes and soulless townscapes, which clearly foreshadow his later apocalyptic paintings. And he began sculpting, initially using construction site materials and whatever else he could get his hands on. He then moved on to drawing. Semi-abstract, distorted and tormented figures, often with explicit sexualized themes, which could not be shown in the artistically conservative People's Republic of Poland. He later explained he had come across an old German forensic psychiatry textbook, which illustrated the darker aspects of human behaviour, and for a while he thought he might be capable of such things himself, but eventually, with relief, he discarded such ideas. I don't know which book he discovered, but there were some extremely judgmental texts published in pre-war Germany that advocated drastic eugenic measures for all sorts of mental disorders that later evolved into the Aktion T4 or T4 extermination program. In 1959, he began working as a designer at the Autosan bus factory in Sanok, originally founded by his great-grandfather. He worked on designs of several new buses and minibuses, but he was considered too modern, and all of his designs were rejected by the Warsaw Motor Transport Assessment Commission, which stuck with more conservative styling. In the early 1960s, he began to paint. When interviewed later in life, he said, "I started as an expressionist. What I did seemed to flow right from my soul, and was almost identical with what other young Polish artists were doing, even though I did not know them. Silhouettes crying in the wilderness, people with heads of stone, women in labour, people caught in the acts of copulation, defecation, death, in front of a firing squad or on the gallows, in prison, towns without windows, and so on and so forth." Perhaps because the bleakness of his work struck a chord with the Polish people, his paintings and drawings sold well, even in the early stages of his career. In 1960, the International Association of Art Critics Congress was held in Poland, and Beksinski was invited to exhibit. This led to him being offered a scholarship from the Guggenheim Museum in New York, a fantastic opportunity for a young artist, but he turned it down as he didn't want to leave Poland. He later said people struggled to understand his decision, but he was not driven by materialism. He didn't want a car like everybody else. He just wanted to tinker. He wanted to do what he liked doing, not what others thought he should do. Around this time, he also tried his hand at writing short stories, completing over 40 in a 2-year period. As with his painting, he experimented with form and subject matter. Some have a loose, dreamlike quality. Others are philosophical self-reflections, post-apocalyptic stories, or conventional crime thrillers. He wasn't happy with the results, however, and sealed them away, deciding to focus on painting. But after his death, a collection of his stories was published. Throughout his artistic life, he worked while listening to classical music, often with the volume turned very high. I'd love to know if he also liked the music of his Polish contemporary Witold Lutosławski, one of my favourite composers, whom I was lucky enough to see perform his own music at the Usher Hall in Edinburgh. To me, Lutosławski's uneasy, dystonic music is the perfect match for Beksinski's paintings. But he preferred post-Wagnerian late Romantic composers, Gustav Mahler and Karol Szymanowski amongst others. He also liked popular music, but he couldn't work to it, as he would start swaying in time and be unable to paint. In 1964, he had his first major one-man show at the Old Orangery in Warsaw, and was soon acknowledged as one of the leading figures in Polish art, and, more importantly, allowed to reduce his hours at the bus factory to just 6 hours a day. After this, he began to reflect on his earlier work and realise he had not been the first to discover expressionism, nor the first to think that life was senseless, and he began to feel a little ashamed of the unrestrainedness of his outcry, and that he wanted to become more detached. So he entered what he called his fantastic period, which lasted for almost 2 decades. His paintings from this period are his best-known works, unsettling images of gloomy environments filled with death and decay, oppressive surrealist figures, skeletons, bleak landscapes and post-apocalyptic deserts devoid of life. Although his paintings might look as if they are airbrushed or AI generated, he created them with meticulous technique using oil paints on hardboard panels. He never gave titles to his paintings, believing that each viewer should interpret them in any way they wanted. In his first period of painting, his work was influenced by Eastern mysticism and was full of symbolism and mysterious content. When asked where his ideas came from, he said he was painting in such a manner as if I were photographing dreams. Despite the grimness of his subjects, Beksiński claimed some of his works were misunderstood. In his opinion, they were rather optimistic, or even humorous. But he was adamant that he did not know the meaning of his artworks, and was uninterested in possible interpretations. And this was the reason he never gave title to any of his drawings or paintings. In the 1970s, his reputation grew and he had exhibitions in Germany and Italy, and in 1977 he moved to Warsaw. Before leaving Sanok, however, he burned a number of his works in his backyard without leaving any photographs or documentation about them, as he considered them too personal. Given how dark many of his surviving works are, it would be fascinating to see what those pictures he consigned to the flames looked like. He spent the rest of his life in a Warsaw apartment. He and his wife cared for his mother, and later Zofia's mother, when they became frail. And their son Tomasz lived in an apartment close by and worked as a radio presenter, movie translator and music journalist. In the 1980s, Beksiński's work began to attract greater attention from international buyers, especially in Japan, France and the United States, and there were endless requests for him to attend shows around the world, all of which he politely turned down. In this period his style became simpler, and he used a more restricted and subdued colour palette, further distinguishing his work from other artists popular at the time. This can be seen in his 1985 painting. As usual, he did not name it, but it is usually referred to helmet or soldier. One commentator has suggested his use of the colour Prussian blue, which is a salt of cyanide, is a reference to Zyklon B, the poison used in wartime death camps. In 1998, his beloved wife Zofia died of cancer, and a year later, on Christmas Eve, his son took his own life, and Beksiński discovered his body. Because of the nature of his art, some said the family was cursed. He was devastated. He struggled to come to terms with his son's death, and he kept a letter to him pinned to his wall. But somehow he found the strength to continue working and to continue trying new things. He had been interested in computers since they first became available in Poland and would buy every new product entering the market, passing on older items to family and friends. By the late 1990s, the technology had reached a point where he was able to use digital photography and editing to create the kind of images he'd always wanted, and he focused on digital work for the rest of his life. It seemed his career had come full circle, and he had returned to his first medium, manipulated photographs. When he was 74, Robert Kupiec, the teenage son of his longtime caretaker, asked him for a loan of about $100. Beksinski refused, and they argued. Kupiec returned later with his 16-year-old cousin and killed him in his flat. They tried to cover up the crime by hiding his body on the balcony and cleaning up the blood. They then stole a couple of cameras and some CDs, but they were arrested shortly afterwards, and Kupiec was sentenced to 25 years in prison. When you look at Beksinski's paintings, it's easy to imagine their creator as dark, cheerless, and obsessed with death. But those who knew him described him as a pleasant man who enjoyed chatting with friends and who had a keen sense of humour. He is said to have been modest and rather shy around people he didn't know, but with no sense of the brooding darkness that pervades so much of his work. He was generous and donated many of his works to charitable causes. Although his works often include religious imagery, he wasn't a religious man, saying he lost his faith slowly in instalments, but he didn't say why. Is there a clue in his 1974 painting, In Hoc Signo Vinces, in which a grim reaper-like figure surrounded by bones peers into a cradle? The Latin inscription translates to, "In this sign thou shalt conquer." It is a phrase associated with the Roman Emperor Constantine and his Christianization of the Roman world, and it was adopted by many later kings and leaders to justify their actions, including the so-called first commander of the American Nazi Party, George Rockwell. Is this a critique of religion, or of those who use religion to subjugate others? As for a mental disorder, Beksinski spoke openly about having a lifelong problem with obsessive-compulsive disorder that dominated his life and made him reluctant to travel. He said it didn't matter whether the journey concerned deportation to Siberia or a luxury yacht trip around the world. Everything that separated him from his base exposed him to a specific conditioned nervous tension. He referred to his condition as neurotic diarrhea, and even exhibitions of his own work he found a great stress, and he tried to avoid them and any other changes to his routine, unannounced visits or unexpected events as much as possible. When asked about what inspired his creations, he often said he didn't know, or that they were based on dreams. In one of his last interviews, he likened dreams to the free association that occurs in psychotherapy, and said that although his unconscious must be revealed in them in some sense, his ideas just come, not led by any rational thinking, they just appear. He once said he drew inspiration from literature, music, and observation of his surroundings, but emphasised the inspiration was casual, incidental, fragmentary, and explained that he saw an old man at a tram stop in Warsaw with a wisp of grey hair tousled by the wind, and that he repeatedly tried to paint the wisp and place it in a picture, but he never succeeded. He also avoided attempts to analyse the content of his work, saying, "I don't want to say or convey anything. I just paint what comes to my mind." He did acknowledge the influence of other surrealists on his work, and spoke about seeing Böcklin's Isle of the Dead as a child, which made a great, unforgettable impression on him, which lasted his whole life. However, he resisted attempts to compare his work to Hieronymus Bosch and his fellow Polish artist Bronislaw Linka. Although he read widely and loved music, he almost never visited museums or exhibitions of other artists' work, as he felt that if he got their images into his mind, he wouldn't be able to get rid of them. For someone with such a keen visual memory, it would not have been easy to forget what he must have witnessed growing up in German-occupied Poland and the oppressive post-war Soviet era, and with its frequent disappearances. He never spoke publicly about what he saw or didn't see, but it would be hard to imagine that he was not traumatised by the events going on around him. And some have suggested that his art is a reflection of post-traumatic stress disorder. But not everyone exposed to traumatic events develops post-traumatic stress disorder. People process trauma in different ways. And it seems likely to me, as a psychiatrist who's treated many people with PTSD and spoken to others who've survived terrible events without any lasting mental illness, that Beksinski was dealing with his experiences by painting them out of his mind. And I think this is why he avoided discussing what had inspired them. Even if you're unfamiliar with his paintings, Beksinski's style has been so influential on modern culture, movies, video games, musicians and other artists, that you will hardly have been able to escape it. Guillermo del Toro acknowledges his influence, and it has been suggested that H.R. Giger, known for his designs for the Alien movies, was also inspired by Beksinski. Poland is the place to go if you want to see his art. His hometown of Sanok has a purpose-built museum in a wing of the castle, and other cities also have collections of his work. So, I know where my next holiday is going to be. Thank you for watching, and thank you to Razoni for suggesting this topic. I don't mind admitting that I didn't know anything about Beksinski or his art before embarking on this video, but I do now. And can I apologise for any mispronunciations? Polish isn't the easiest language to get your tongue around, but I've done my best. As always, I'd love to hear your views on this video and any suggestions you may have for future topics. I've got a to-do list that'll keep me going for years, but I always like to hear about new subjects and people I've never heard of. And some, like Beksinski, are so interesting that they just push themselves up to the top of the list. So please subscribe and click for notifications to be kept up to date with all the latest videos. But apart from that, I'll say goodbye and I hope to see you again soon. Goodbye.